Hi, everybody. So, welcome to Chapter 5, World War One, Versailles Treaty, and the Great Turning Point. And this lecture is going to be a two-parter. I'm not going to say something like it's not going to be a long lecture. I don't know. I saw that from my last lecture, and it was like 45 minutes, so I'm not going to say that. Hope you guys are all doing good. Hope you guys are all staying healthy. This might time date this lecture, but I'm battling COVID right now, although I do feel a lot better, but I still tested positive yesterday, so I'm home. But I don't feel too bad. I feel relatively good, so in any case, hope you guys are all doing good. Hope you guys are feeling good. So grab a cup of coffee or iced tea like I have going right here with some lemon, with my aging Seattle Mariners cup, which is ironic because I got this last summer. I'm not a Mariners fan. I'm a Red Sox fan. But I was up there to watch a game with my family. Great stadium. Started raining part way, or threatening to rain, so they closed the dome. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I love going to baseball games. So that has nothing to do with this lecture, but I hope you guys are doing good. Also, I'm wearing my Stanislaus sweatshirt. I got my master's there. I got a real good education there. They work me hard. So, in any case, that's enough about me. I hope you guys are doing good. And grab a pen and pencil. Get comfortable. Yeah, get your drink of choice. And some handy paper. And let's jump in together. So, all right. So one of the things about an event like World War One that is so big, it's just almost so overwhelming. It's hard to in any kind of personal way connect with something that's so massive. And it's black and white, of course, as we see it in the modern world. And in some ways, in the U.S. context, the U.S. has never had, I should say never, most Americans have not really felt the impact of World War One like it was so profoundly impacted Europe. Europe was devastated by the war. Europe has changed profoundly by the war. The shock and trauma of that terrible war on Europe is still present today. If you have a chance to visit Europe sometime, not been to England, France, or other places, there are World War One memorials all over the place. When we were in France last time, we were staying near the Palace of Versailles, nice area. Our little hotel was just about 100 feet from a World War One monument. And that wasn't the only one. There are many, many there because, of course, it played such a great role in the lives of so many millions and millions of people all throughout Europe. But, of course, not just Europe. Africa, the Middle East, on into Asia, and, of course, even the Americas to a certain extent, too. So to try to help you guys personalize that a little bit more, I want to tell you guys the impact on this war on one specific family. And the family is actually, let me scroll down for a minute. There's Kathy Kollwitz. She was a German artist. At the start of the war, her young son, Peter, decides to join up. His whole class are excited. I think he was just finishing high school. They're the young man, Peter, full of life, as a probably typical 18-year-old. He was 18, might have been 17 or 18. He was a young man, full of life, potential, the whole world ahead of him, like many of you. World War One breaks out like any other patriotic young man in any of the countries in Europe. He rushes to join the colors of the nation, to protect his nation, the adventure of the war, the glory to come, and to do his part. Of course, his mother, including Kathy, was quite worried, but also felt it's a patriotic duty as a German family to support the war effort. And so, although obviously she's reluctant because she's a parent, like any parent, worries about their son or their daughter going to war. They're worried, but they feel like they, just part of being a parent in a war. You have to do your part too, and that includes putting your heart out there and hoping for the best that your son will be okay. Here's a photograph of her son. That's the last known photograph we have of him. That's Peter right there, as he's walking toward the front. And you guys probably know what's coming. The fact I'm talking about this story is young Peter is killed before he even got to the front lines. His unit is marching to the front line, and there was some French artillery that burst over them. He was killed in the explosion. He's one of the very first men in his unit to die, and he had not even got to the front lines yet. Technically, obviously, he's getting into combat the idea at their range of French artillery, but actually had not even got to the trenches that we tend to think of as of the place of combat or the actual firing line. He was still behind that when his unit came under artillery attack, and he was killed. That was very early in the war. It's just that first late summer and early fall when her son is killed. Again, one of the first, perhaps the first person in his unit to be killed. Of course, one of many, many, many to be killed. Now that was early in the war. Again, that was just in the first few months of the war. And of course, this terrible meat grinder will go on for the next 4 years and just consume countless lives across Europe and across the Middle East and Africa, the places as well too. And his mother, Kathy Kollwitz, is processing this grief. The grief is so profound for her that for a time she stopped producing art, just devastated. And of course she realized that it's not just her personal devastation, it's devastation in Germany, and of course all of Europe, of course. Now she's in Germany, but of all of Europe. And the extraordinary grief. And eventually, after this darkness and grief, she begins to slowly construct art again. And in many pieces she constructs is dealing with that grief, that terror, that sense of loss, that profound shattering of life. And these are one of the pieces of artwork she produced. You see a bunch of mothers and young kids huddling together, and that's just the grief of the war, the extraordinary loss of the war for so many families. Not tied, of course, just to Germany. She happens to be German, but for any family in this terrible maelstrom of conflict of humanity and the extraordinary loss and fear and irreplaceable grief that comes with that. She also felt a lot of besides obviously devastating grief, she felt a lot of responsibility, which is how do we not protect our son from this terrible reality? You know, he's 18, and so of course he's excited and hopeful and wants to win glory and adventure and do his part for Germany. And she's wondering, how as an adult, as a parent, how do we not see this coming? How do we not see what this horror is going to turn into? And as a parent, our responsibility, how do we let this happen? How the old generation of adults let this terrible thing take place and just devour so many young men? And of course, of all ages, men, women, children too, because war does not touch only just the combatants, as you guys know. I'm wondering, how do we allow this to happen? And she feels a tremendous personal grief responsibility, both personally but also as a nation and as a civilization itself, that how could the older generations have allowed this to happen? So much so that as the years roll by after the war and she recovers, begins to produce more and more art, she begins to think, is something I could do to, in a sense, apologize to my son and to all the young men and the shattered lives of beyond the young men, the men, women, and children who died in this terrible conflict, lives forever upended. And is there something I could do to make amends, to show our remorse for what has taken place? And eventually she decided to do a sculpture of her husband and herself in a place of kneeling supplication, begging forgiveness from her son, and symbolically all these young men, all these lives lost in this terrible war. And eventually she would complete that sculpture. Her idea was to place that sculpture at the cemetery where her son was buried. Now, her son was actually buried, I believe, in Belgium. The Belgian government was not interested in a German artist putting a piece of art in a Belgian cemetery, even though obviously there are German war dead buried there. But Belgium's response basically was, well, the German war dead should not have been here because the German war dead are here because they invaded our country. So they were not interested initially. Now, eventually, though, accommodation made. I don't think they brought her son back into German cemetery. But in any case, eventually, her sculpture of herself and her husband would be installed. And let me show that to you. There's the two of them. And eventually, the Belgian government relented, and Kathy had her sculpture of her and herself. And that's Kathy there, wrapped in grief, begging on her knees, begging forgiveness, and her husband too, begging forgiveness for all the young men for allowing this terrible thing to happen. Now, part of the sad irony of when this finally took place is when Kathy finally finished her sculpture, there was an opening exhibition in Germany, but this is art in the 1930s when she finished. They actually had to hire armed guards because they're worried about Nazi brown shirts coming into her art gallery for the exhibition and defacing or potentially even destroying the sculpture because, of course, her sculpture is profoundly humane, it's anti-war, and in the context of 1930s Germany, that is not what the Nazi Party is about, as you guys know well. So the fact that she's making a very profound anti-war statement, that she realizes we have to protect these pieces of artwork because the brown shirts and the Nazis were already in a position of coming to power and already beginning to use massive violence against opponents or dissenters of any kind. Eventually, as you see, the grieving parents, the title of the sculpture will be installed there in Belgium. And that is certainly emblematic of what this war is going to cost so many millions of lives throughout Europe and beyond. And that takes us to a little more of the context. Prior to World War I, excuse me, let me get a drink here. That helps. Okay, so prior to World War I, there had been a general thought, because the Enlightenment, scientific revolution, industrialization, that human society was evolving to ever higher levels of civilizational development. There had been a lot of excitement post-French Revolution, actually even before that, frankly, just Enlightenment in general, that humanity is growing increasingly more logical. We're no longer being guided by age-old, baseless superstitions of one kind or another, whether it be cultural, in some contexts it would be belief, it would be religious, but that these things are being gradually evaporated in the sunlight of reason and science and progress, and that humanity is a steadily progressing to ever higher level of civilizational development. Of course, Darwinian thought also plays into this, and humanity is growing increasingly developed, sophisticated, and we're moving beyond the primitive aspects of human civilization. For example, useless war and the carnage war brings, but that civilization is evolving beyond these primitive occupations of a simpler, more brutal humanity. And in some ways, it seemed like that had been, to some degree, well, not if you're paying close attention. But I'd say if you're naively optimistic in Europe, you may perceive that, because Europe, following the Napoleonic Wars, there had not been a lot of major warfare in Europe, although there's some exceptions, as you guys know from this class. For example, the Franco-Prussian War, just to name one. But there had not been, I suppose, on the same level of warfare. And following the Franco-Prussian War, you have a series of decades where, for the most part, Europe is quite quiet, and you do not have major armed conflict. So again, the thought is that Europe is evolving out from these more primitive stages, and we're going more sophisticated because of our trade, our culture, because of science and discovery and so forth, and moving beyond this. I've got a couple examples of that, just excitement. Albert Einstein is already beginning to open up just extraordinary new windows into larger universe, physics and quantum theory, relativity, the atomic age. Sigmund Freud is opening up the human mind in profound ways, although you guys know from reading from our class, because you guys read a little bit of Freud already, Freud is not on board with the idea that we all were just incredibly rational human beings who make scientific decisions based purely on the evidence, that we're releasing any more of our primitive human instincts. That's not what Freud says. So the irony of excitement of pushing new frontiers that comes with Freud, yes, that is excitement, but that is actually not go with the narrative of of things getting better and better, because Freud's like, again, if you read the part of Freud we read for class already, and then more to come, Freud is saying that this human subconscious is dark. The drives are primitive. So the idea that we are becoming simply more rational and our decisions we make in everyday lives are rational and thoughtful, Freud's like, yeah, we try to, but in reality, the drives inside of us for power and sex and all these other psychological drives are profound and often overrule whatever logical process we have going on there. But in any case, but the context of time, though, for those who are not reading Freud, but generally familiar, which is, again, the kind of excitement, these new frontiers. Same thing in modern art. You have geniuses like Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse pushing new avenues of expression visually. An example of that would be Picasso's masterpiece, Les Demoulins Avignon, and I'm not sure that's exactly my correct pronunciation. I took a little French in college, but that was a long time ago. And I was only ankle deep in the first place. So, and again, for some of you that may not be your cup of tea, it's a very shocking painting. It was very shocking in that time period when Pablo Picasso painted it. But in many ways, he's shattering our visual perception of how things are. Whether you like that particular piece of art or not, it is emblematic of this new era of excitement, seeing things anew. Matisse is doing the same thing too, even though this painting in some ways, again, for some reason might seem kind of primitive and simple, and I suppose in some ways it is, but visually, again, he's breaking all kinds of molds there. He is a very talented artist, so it's not actually genius, not just talented, genius artist. So he knows what he's doing, but again, he's reframing things dramatically with a new excitement. So again, this excitement of new technology and artistic expression and scientific discoveries is rolling through Europe, and excitement is we're entering an ever newer, greater era of excitement. And then, of course, World War I comes along, and it shatters this illusion that humanity, especially in the context of Europe, is growing ever more sophisticated and beyond these more primitive occupations, if you could call war an occupation. The cost of war is staggering. 9 million soldiers die in this war. That, of course, does not count non-combatant death. That's simply soldiers. The scale of the loss of life is even now hard to wrap our minds around, but it's massive. And it's not simply the carnage of human bodies left on these smoke and blackened battlefields, but also the chaos momentum spawned by the war is going to profoundly change Europe to this day. And let's look at that briefly. For example, humiliation, bitterness will be a major factor in the rise of the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler in particular. This photograph, it shows General Ludendorff standing next to Adolf Hitler. Whoops, there we go. That's a little better. Is evocative of the idea of the tie of World War I. You see Ludendorff, one of the highly respected German generals in World War I, and a man who was simply a corporal in World War I, which is Adolf Hitler. But the tie of those two together visually reveals a larger truth, which is Hitler is a child, of course, of World War I. And the chaos and the trauma unleashed by World War I is going to open a window of time, tragically for all of us. Let's open a window of time for Hitler to emerge into this era of bitterness, depression, anger, failure, sense of betrayal in Germany. And Hitler, as you guys might know well, is going to exploit that to the dark consequences for us all. Of course, it's not just Hitler that emerges out of the chaos. The Bolshevik or Russian Revolution, of course, is going to be unleashed by chaos developing this Russia. There's Vladimir Lenin, of course, Stalin on his left, and both those gentlemen will come to national prominence and influence because of World War I. Without World War I, perhaps, again, we'll never know. Perhaps we'll probably have not heard of either one of those gentlemen. But the devastation to Russia, the humiliation, loss of Russia is, again, open up a window of time, just like we did in Germany after the war, in Russia too, to allow the Bolshevik Marxist experiment, first spearheaded by Lenin and later on by Stalin, to emerge and be transformative of Russia and of Europe and the world. America is thrust onto the world stage in a much greater context, although for the context of our class, we're not going to get into that. We're focused on Europe primarily. But the Middle East is profoundly changed by this war, not to mention East Asia, Ukraine, as you guys know. We already talked about Ukraine in earlier lectures, but Europe is just profoundly influenced. Asia will be too, although in the context of our class, we're not going to get into Asia. But certainly the Middle East, we will talk about that some. So an example of that is, although this map is in French, so but it's the best I could find, that shows you in green the Ottoman Empire there. And take a look at that. That says pre-World War I. This is 1912, that map there. You can see European colonization there. The Italian there is in pink. Purple is Great Britain. France's colonial empire is that orange, I guess? And then you see post-World War One, and it's just radically different. The whole Middle East Ottoman Empire ceased to exist, although Turkey remains. Okay, there's Turkey, right? But the rest of the Ottoman Empire, which they controlled, is now gone. Instead, you have the formation of many of the states that would become our modern Middle East we're familiar with today. All of this is the consequence of the long-term repercussions of World War One. Additionally, and this is a sad one, but the beginning of the 20th century also experiences the first, I suppose, we would have to define it as modern genocide, and that'd be the Armenian genocide in the Ottoman Turkish Empire. We'll come back to this topic a little bit later in actually the lecture part 2, not in this lecture, but the follow-on lecture from this one. We'll come back to this one. So I think I'm just going to very briefly touch on it now. That shows you a depiction of Armenian citizens being marched out of a town there in the Ottoman Empire. Most of those, sadly, are going to disappear. Either shot in the back of the head of someplace, either in prison, out in the desert where their body be left to wither away in the scorching sun, having starved or due to dehydration have died, and now they've been left to their bones to rot. Most of those in that photograph are the leadership being taken out. Most of the men in the community, the Turks wanted to decapitate the Armenian leadership at the start of the genocide. That way it'd be harder for the Armenians to mobilize, to have any kind of effective resistance. Yeah, this photograph is actually taken by the U.S. ambassador, I believe, showing Armenians taken out in the countryside and either killed outright or left to starve or die from dehydration of thirst. And this is in 1915, and the U.S. ambassador being stunned by this and appealing to Washington is something the U.S. government can do to bring this horrific nightmare to an end. We'll come back to that topic later. I just want to introduce, because that's going to take place, of course, in the context of World War I too. Because the Armenian genocide, although there have already been anti-Armenian, quite very serious massacres in previous decades, so it didn't come from nowhere. But again, the chaos and tensions unleashed by World War I is going to open up that window of darkness where the Armenian genocide takes place on a far grander scale. Okay. So let's move on to the war itself. And I'm a military buff. I would like to spend a long time talking about this war and its military aspects, Verdun and the Somme and Passchendaele, but we're not going to do that. We don't have time for that. So I'll let you guys do that on your own. So if some of you guys are military buffs and want to dig into the tactical play-by-play of the war in all its trauma, I'd recommend that. But in this lecture, we're going to have to not do that. I'll mention some things briefly, but all right. Yeah, the Nightmare of Industrial Slaughter, 1914-18. There's some young German soldiers heading to the front on to Paris. They're not going to get to Paris, although they got relatively close. But that enthusiasm and excitement at that typified the very start of the war, of course, is not going to last. Because, of course, you think excitement here, and then you get this. Right? This is the painting by Louis Werter of 1918, showing you the nightmare of the front lines there. Just a hellscape. By the way, right now, I recommend to you guys, there's an award-winning film, a remake of the Louis Marquet's classic, All Quiet on the Western Front, and that's out on, I think, Netflix right now. I recommend it to you guys. Not going to be easy to watch, but the reality, the nightmare of what it's like in the horrific industrialized fighting in World War I. So as you guys already know, Germany had the Schifflin Plan, which is to strike and knock France out of the war very quickly, and then they will turn and defeat France. The Schifflin Plan did launch quite well initially, but the Germans were overly optimistic on it being able to keep up the timetable. Ultimately, it fails. They did get close to Paris. The Germans got close to it, but they were exhausted by the French and British, who fought very hard. And the Belgians too. It wasn't just the French and British. The Belgians they were fighting too. And the Germans are not able to knock France out of the war in that quick 6-week campaign, which had been their idea and their vision. I had to pause there. My daughter from college called me for a minute. So, okay, so, all right. As you guys know, the war eventually grinds into a stalemate, and it'll stay largely a stalemate in the Western Front all the way from late 1914 all the way to 1918. Although there's going to be some movement back and forth, so that's not totally true. And again, I'm not going to do a play-by-play for the war. I'm going to move really quickly through this, but I'd say the war has actually more than this. But there's a Western Front, which we're quite well known, probably for education and media. What nearly is not as well known is the Eastern Front. Now, we've done a little bit with the war of Ukraine, as you guys know, but the Eastern Front obviously is a major portion of the war too, and that actually goes quite different. The war on the Eastern Front actually involves a lot more movement. Now, you also have the war in the Middle East. Again, that's not so well known. Typically, we don't spend much time on that one. And you also had fighting in Africa and other places too, although not on a major scale, but there's some fighting in Africa too. Really over German colonies and Great Britain and France trying to take over the German colonies, which they largely will. Yeah, just the nightmare reality of that in-close fighting in the war. Of course, civilians also caught up in all this too, right? So just depends where you live, what's taking place. This is a very simple painting, but a tragic one by Nevinson, 1916, shown just typical civilian, perhaps going out to get bread for the morning. We don't know the backstory for this, but being killed. The consequence could be shelling or just some of the political violence taking place. But the death stalking many a European street and alleyway during this war. The war being as massive as it was, I want to give you one kind of brief example of just the nature of what the war is like. There's a special memorial called the Memorial of the Trench of the Bayonets, which according to France, there was a unit of French soldiers who was buried alive by shell burst. And so much dirt came down upon them, getting buried alive in the trench, but these massive German shells land, these mass explosions show up, just a volcano of earth, and so you have a whole unit just buried alive. So when they came across it later, they saw some bayonets sticking out of the dirt. But the men, so much weight on them, not to mention the concussion, the force of the earth coming down, that they all died there. And they decided not to dig them out. They simply left them buried there in the trench. And they remain there to this day. And this memorial right here is depicting that horrific reality. That's inside the memorial. That's the dirt there, and they put some crosses there to signify that's where the trench had been, and these young men buried alive. And of course, as the war grinds on, oftentimes you have areas fought over months and months, and so you have bodies left in no man's land, as you guys know, and 6 months later, shell bursts and disinterns these rotting remains of young men that could never be buried in the first place because they're in the kill zone and the no man's land, and then that they're disinterred. So for the soldiers fighting there, and you can see one sitting right here, you can imagine what a hellish environment that would be to fight and to live and die for those involved. Of course, a big part of this, oops, there's a typo there. Let's get that fixed. There we go. Technology, modern slaughter. Of course, a lot of this is some new technologies comes along. Machine gun is not brand new, but it's relatively new. Heavy artillery is not new, but just it's ever more lethal. Gas warfare is really new, and we'll get to that here in a minute, but aircraft, submarines, tanks, all these new technologies come along. And there's an example of that. There's a French tank from late in the war, brand new technology to allow one side to advance across no man's land and be able to break through the front lines. And you also have the first use of airships. In this case, it's a German Zeppelin flying over perhaps a French, or could be London too, over a city, dropping bombs. That photograph on the left is a piece of modern art, but actually it's not. It's a little bit exaggerated, but that's a splinter pattern painted onto a warship to try to confuse German submarines. If they see it from a great distance through a periscope, all those kind of splintered black and white and gray lines are designed to confuse the captain of a U-boat, so he's not sure of which way the ship is going, which direction it's going, because it's such visually so. And of course, that is to prevent, we see on the right, the terrible loss of life at sea from the submarine campaigns. Submarine campaigns is something that's new. It's terrifying because, again, you could be in a ship. It could be a beautiful day. say like Lusitania, and the next thing you know, you see a trail of bubbles coming towards you at high speed, and there's a mass explosion. A column of water shoots up next to the ship. Some of these massive ships go down within a minute or two. And a tremendous loss of life that comes with that, and that's just a part of this modern industrial warfare that's new to humanity and the shocking aspect of humanity of what this has brought to the world. I mentioned poison gas already. All sides use it. The Germans used it initially, but the other sides began to use it too. So it wasn't just the Germans, including even the U.S. late in the war, we used it too. In order to try to break the front lines, there's different ways it's employed. Sometimes simple gas canisters were used. Other times they use artillery shells that have gas inside of them. There's a variety of ways. Whatever the case is, it's a new terrifying aspect of modern warfare. You can see some examples of that there on the right. That photograph you can see, that's a German unit on the eastern front, and they're spraying out gas. The gas drifts over to enemy lines. And for those people who are not able to get out of the way in time, you see on the left, those are British soldiers who were not able to get out of the trench in time or get their gas mask on in time. And it's a pretty savage way to die. Not pretty, it's savage. There's a variety of different gases, but the gases tend to burn any exposed skin they're exposed to. But the way they typically kill a person is if you breathe them in, it gets into your lungs begin to bleed internally. You can't breathe because your lungs are bleeding instead of being able to process oxygen molecules across the membrane of the lung. That is completely destroyed. It's burned or fried by this poison gas, and a person simply drowns without being underwater because they cannot breathe. It's a pretty horrific way to die. Those British soldiers on the left there, they have been gassed. Now, they're fortunate. Well, not fortunate. No one's fortunate to be gassed. But they're fortunate that they'll probably recover, fortunately for them. Maybe have some scars, but recover. Same thing for that young man here on the right. If you look closely, you can see burn marks here beneath on his arm. You can see it's all swollen up there around his neck. His face is burned. And now again, fortunately, he survived being gassed, but certainly he'll be scarred for life by what took place. You don't need to know all three types of gas there. Chlorine, physogene, and mustard, they're all bad. But if you guys are more curious, we'll dig into that farther. But the reality, there's also a terror that this gas could be used large scale in civilians. Now, in World War I, that was not the case, although in some later conflicts, even into the modern times, tragically, there has been some examples of poison gas being used on people, especially in Iraq. Saddam Hussein in Iraq used poison gas on the Kurds. So that photograph on the right is a stage photograph. That's not what's taking place here, but the fear of what could bring in the next war. That's why in World War II, ironically, the nightmare of World War II, when they did not use poison gas, all sides are so terrified of its potential on civilian life to all sides, including the Nazis, ironically, did not use poison gas. Although the Japanese use a little bit in China, but okay. Early mechanized warfare, of course, a tank is invented during the war, and that's going to transform warfare, as you guys know as well, especially in World War II. But in World War I, it does a bit too. The air war, again, new technology employed to fighting at the start of the war. The airplanes were almost basically like a Wright brother plane, very simple, unarmed. In fact, in the first few months of the war, there is no aerial combat. Planes that fly around monitoring armies below them, took photographs, but there was no aerial combat in the first couple months of the war. But that changed. They began arming themselves. You see that photograph on the left, you can see there's a pilot there, a soldier next to him with a rifle. Pretty soon they start integrating with could we mount a machine gun? Of course they will, and they'll find ways to do that. Eventually, the Germans found an even better way. This one right here, you can see the machine gun is mounted above the propeller arc, so you can fire outside of the arc propeller. But eventually, the Germans found a way through their the Fokker E1 or the Eindecker. They found a way to actually synchronize the propeller with the machine gun, so you actually fire through the machine gun, which is much more accurate and work much better once you'd be able to do that. And of course, the rest is sadly history, a whole series of improvements. By the end of the war, the fighters are quite sophisticated and they're lethal killing machines, as you guys know. Which shows in a few short years from 1914 to 1918, you have tremendous changes in aviation was possible. For example, by the end of the war, you have large-scale heavy bombers like this Handley Page bomber right here being attacked by German fighters. Oil becomes ever more important during the war. Of course, it was even before the war, but that's going to make Europe after the war acutely sensitive to try to find direct sources for oil. Especially in the context of our class of Great Britain and France, nations scrambling to get access to oil, because that time for Great Britain and France did not have any domestic oil, but they want it. Now, obviously, you guys look at this map right here, there's certain countries that certainly had quite a bit. You guys see there in the Middle East, and so that's going to heighten both British and French interest in the Middle East, which we'll get to in our second lecture. All right, war in the Middle East, that's going to be a major turning point as well too. As you guys know, the Ottoman Empire controlled much of today. What today we think of the modern Middle East is controlled by the Ottoman Empire. But many of those Arab populations within the Ottoman Empire would like their independence. The nationalism we talked about in the context of Europe is also taking place in the larger Arab world. And the Ottoman Turks are not Arabs. You guys probably know that, right? The Turks are Turks. They speak a different language, culturally, religiously less so, but culturally certainly they have a different outlook. And the Ottoman Empire it's an empire controlled by the Turks, and it encompasses many people. But many of those are Arabs, and Arabs who would like their own national aspirations to be met, and that means independence from the Ottoman Turks. So World War I is provide a window of opportunity. It looks like maybe they can get their independence as they hoped. Lawrence Arabia, probably the most famous Western individual tied to the less understood fighting there in the Middle East, plays a major role, as you guys know. He's sent by the British government to coordinate with the leaders in what today would be Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia did not exist as a place then. It existed as Arabia, but not Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is actually from the Saud family. They sent there to help organize with the Arab leadership there in their fight against the Ottoman Turks. Now, the Arabs are not interested in fighting for Great Britain. They really don't care about the context of World War I, but they do know the Ottoman Turks are under pressure and they're weakened. So World War I opens a window opportunity for many Arab groups to think perhaps this is our chance to break off from the Ottoman Empire and become an independent nation, or perhaps a pan-Arab nation. And there is various conceptions of what this would look like. Some Arabs felt that we'll have a unified pan-Arab nation that maybe would extend today what we think from Syria all the way down to today would be Saudi Arabia, and be one unified Arab people. Now, clearly that never happened, but that was on the mind certainly of some as aspirational hope for happening. Great Britain and France are more than happy to encourage this perception that we are here to liberate you from the Ottoman Turks. Not so much, as you guys will see coming up a little bit later again, our second lecture, because the British and the French have their own game, and they certainly are interested in the local oil that's coming out of the ground in many potential Arab nations or a pan-Arab empire. And so there certainly is a double game being played. Lawrence Arabia, by the way, was aware of this double game and did not want to participate in that double game, and to the best of his ability is trying to aid the Arabs to steer clear to achieve their own national fulfillment, whatever that may be, individual Arab nations or a larger pan-Arab nation or empire. The war in the East, we talked about this briefly, but quite briefly, but a little bit in the context of Ukraine. But of course, the war in the East is beyond just Ukraine, right? There's a terrible fighting there largely between Russia and Germany, but of course, Austria-Hungary is involved in there too. Romania, the nations are of course all involved with this too. Now, as you guys probably have some talk about the war, World War I and Ukraine. Although Germany ultimately is going to lose the war on the Western Front, as you guys know, but in the East, Germany largely won the war, frankly. And this photograph right here shows Austrian-Hungarian troops entering the Ukrainian city. This is late in the war. This would be in early 1918. And of course, the reason why those Austrian-Hungarian troops are entering in there is because the German army is driving north of them and has largely defeated the Russians. So much so that late in the war, and this would be in spring 1918. Russia, desperate to get out of the war. In this case, the Russian Revolution has already taken place, as you guys know. The Bolshevik government under Lenin, realizing this war is exhausting us, we better get out while we can, decides to sign a very humiliating treaty with the Kaiser's Germany, and that's the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, in which Russia cedes much of its former empire to Germany. In the context of our class, again, we see Ukraine right here, as you guys already know. So Ukraine now is freed of Russian control. Now, as you guys know, it's going to be a brief window in time because this is in March 1918. Remember, in November 1918, Germany is defeated. And so it reopens what's going to happen here. So remember, this is when the Ukrainian independence takes place, right? Ukraine declares independence because the Germans are there. The Germans like, fine, as long as you feed us from the wonderful grain fields of the vast breadbasket that is Ukraine, if you guys want to have your own independent nation, fine, we'll support that. Just feed us, because Germany is desperate for food in that time period. So again, that opened that brief window of opportunity for Ukraine to be independent, and they declared independence. Now, as you guys know, tragically for Ukraine, it's not going to last, because of course, once Germany is defeated in 1918, German protection for that part of land seized in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is now gone, and Russia, of course, is rapidly wants to reassert control, and they will, as you guys know. What you see on the right is an anti-Polish poster. It's a Bolshevik poster attacking the Poles. And you see the victorious Red Army right here riding into Poland, being welcomed by the Poles. Well, at least Bolshevik-leaning Poles or communist-leaning Poles. Now, by the way, that's not how it turned out. The Poles were absolutely not, and the Poles rejected the Red Armies moving into Poland. That's some very hard fighting. Eventually, Poland would get their independence again, defeating Russia's attempt to absorb Poland into the Russian Bolshevik Revolution, and they'll be defeated. But in the case of Ukraine, as you guys know, the Red Armies will be successful, and the Red Armies will reclaim what is today Ukraine. The war mercifully comes to an end in 1918. November 11, 1918. You can see some wonderful celebrants there. There's probably in Piccadilly in London. I'm not sure exactly where this photograph was taken, but I imagine London. You see them riding that double-decker bus and tremendous excitement that this nightmare is finally over. So what are the consequences of this war? Of course, Germany is exhausted, as you guys know. America comes into the war late, but Germany, now exhausted, has no choice. The front was collapsing when Germany gave up. Perhaps some German civilians like Hitler, who was in a German hospital at the time period, having been wounded. Hitler may have imagined that Germany had not really lost the war, but he is wrong. Now, it is true, and this is important, I'll mention this briefly. At the end of World War I, there are not Allied armies who have invaded into German territory yet. So if you're in a German city or in a German hospital like Hitler is, you probably could accept the premise that somehow the war was taken from us and that we didn't really lose, but our politicians and the Jews and the communists and the leftists and the weak liberal Democrats, they sold us out. We didn't really lose this war. That's not the case. If the war would have gone on even weeks longer, you would have had Allied armies invading into Germany itself. French and American and British armies would have moved into Germany itself. But the German leaders, realizing that the front was collapsing, I say wisely, and for the protection of German people, said, we have enough. Let's not let it get it worse. It's out of control. The front line's collapsing. We have to stop. And they did. And in many ways, that was good. But again, the tragedy allowed some Germans to see themselves as not defeated. Hitler among many. And they began to look for scapegoats for how they were cheated out of this victory. Now, there was no victory there. But the perception was perhaps there was, and the Germans were able to live with that self-delusion. We don't just pick on the Germans. That's all humanity. We don't like dealing with very uncomfortable truths, right? If it's uncomfortable, we look for any kind of other version of reality or perception of a reality that gives us a more comforting answer. We don't want to go with what is the staring us in the face, especially if it's a very painful reality. But Germany had lost. Significance of this terrible conflict, World War I. This is the French victory parade. After the war, of course, the war kills millions. You guys take a moment here with your notes. You can write this down. War kills millions, of course. Savagely affects nations, cultures, economies. Germany's left defeated, humiliated, deeply angry, nursing a desire for revenge, based on a self-created false reality that somehow they had not lost the war, betrayed by Jews, communists, socialists, etc. Yeah, that's critically important for you guys to know that, and you guys are aware of that. But make sure you guys write that down. The chaos and conflict of the war provide setting for the first genocide of the 20th century. I mentioned the Armenians, although it's not just Armenians. We'll come back to that a little bit later with our second lecture, which will follow on after this one. Middle East is profoundly altered. Brand new boundaries and nations are drawn up. Now, that did help settle some issues, but also gave birth to new issues and new conflicts, new tensions. I mentioned this one already, but it's good to review this again. Remember that the war and the trauma of the war and the chaos opens a window for the emergence of what will be the Nazi Party as well as the Communist Revolution in Russia, two events that profoundly influenced the 20th century and even the 21st century, as you guys know. The optimism of many Europeans that prior to the war that science, reason, high culture, etc. were taking humanity to ever higher levels of existence is shattered. Following the war, many Americans grow skeptical of involvement. And actually, I'm not so concerned with that one. That's more about us. You guys can skip that one. That's definitely true for U.S. history, but for context of Europe, I think we're not going to get into that one. That's the French military cemetery. 130,000 soldiers buried there, unknown. We have, as you guys know, back to Washington, D.C., the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And I believe, I could be wrong, you guys can Google this, I think it's less than 10 soldiers are buried in the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Although I could be wrong, so don't write that down. But the natural reality of industrialized slaughter and just in that one ossuary, there's 130,000 French soldiers unknown, don't know who they are. There's no way they can identify them. The numbers are just so vast, just impossibility of doing that. That's the American cemetery there in the Argonne region. 14,000 Americans are buried there. But of course, that's really a small number compared to what most European nations suffered, as hard as it was for Americans. Vast changes, you guys know. Take a look from 1914. Look at Eastern Europe in 1914. Austrian-Hungarian Empire, after the war, ceased to exist. Instead, you had the formation of nations you and I begin to recognize, for example, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. Poland is reborn. Remember, right? Actually, the Red Army tried to prevent that, right? But the Poles fought very hard and were able to escape the clutches of the Russian Empire. Because you guys know, under Catherine the Great, Poland had ceased to exist as an independent nation. But Poland now is back. You see Lithuania and Latvia also re-emerging as independent nations, although under heavy pressure from Russia. And I think we're about done this lecture. Maybe I'll add that last couple things here. Asia does watch all this, and I think maybe for context of our class, we'll maybe skip that. I think that's more to deal with Africa and Asia. Wilson's 14 points, although maybe, but anyways, we'll skip that for now. Middle East, again, as you guys know, it's a profound turning point. You say ethnic, linguistic, cultural, national tension among Arabs and the Turks. Yes, we talked about that a little bit already. And the desire for some kind of independence, perhaps even a pan-Arab state to develop. Now, that is not going to happen, as you guys know. And we'll get into why that is in the next lecture. But the end of the Ottoman Empire is going to be a profound influence on what takes place there in the Middle East from that time period till today. The repercussions are ongoing. Our modern Middle East is built out of the ashes of the fall of the Ottoman Empire in the final days of World War I. And there's more to come. There's two excellent books there, one by David Fromkin and by Eugene Rogan, talk about the fall of the Ottomans. I'd encourage you guys, if you're history majors, both of those would be rich readings on the profound consequences of what that means. But we're going to stop right here because we need to leave room for our next lecture to come. And you can see a brief preview of the Armenian or Assyrian Greek genocide. But that's for our next lecture. That's enough for this one. That was a very short, very brief overview of that conflict. I encourage you guys to pursue more into World War I. But that's enough for right now, so we'll stop here. So we'll see you with round 2 with our next lecture. Take care, everybody.